Good morning. You're watching All You Need to Know on BloombergQuint Live, and I'm Alex Matthew. First, the headlines this morning. China expects U.S. President Donald Trump to delay the December 15 tariff hike, giving more time to negotiate the first phase of the trade deal. U.S. House Democrats deliver 2 articles of impeachment against Donald Trump for abusing the power of his office. Yes Bank's board meet on Tuesday, that's yesterday, ends inconclusively. The bank says it is considering proposals from both Citex Holdings as well as Irvin Singh Braik. And after sailing through the Lok Sabha, the contentious Citizenship Amendment Bill will be tabled in the Rajya Sabha for discussion today. Let's talk about the U.S. markets now. It was another day of small moves for the U.S. equity markets. Benchmark indices ended with modest losses. Investors are eyeing the rate decision from the FOMC, which will come out later tonight, while also awaiting more cues from the impending tariff deadline on the 15th of December between the U.S. and China. Abigail Doolittle of Bloomberg News wraps up Tuesday's action in this report.
It was another day of very small moves for the major averages in the U.S. in Tuesday's Wall Street session, flipping between small gains and losses were the Dow, the S&P 500, and the Nasdaq. But at the end of the day, each of these major averages finished down slightly, down about 0.1%. This despite many headlines about the USMCA and that has been reached. It will go forward, but it may not be signed by the end of the year. Of course, the impeachment process here in the U.S. There was even a trade headline that China believes that the U.S. will delay those December 15th tariffs. But none of this was enough to actually move stocks. This tells you investors, traders want details, in particular on a possible trade deal between the U.S. and China. And of course, the Fed is ahead on Wednesday. The policy decision, it's largely expected that they will not be changing their policy course at all on that. Bonds traded slightly lower, so it was really a neutral risk appetite given the fact that there were very small moves across asset classes. Now, where there were bigger movers, individual stocks beneath the surface, including AutoZone, those shares up 6.9% on a very strong quarter. They beat earnings. They also beat comp sales. Inventory rose a little bit, but nonetheless, investors sending those shares higher. That was true, too, for Sanofi, the pharma company, up 6.1%, its best day since 2016, on the announcement of a shift in strategy away from certain treatments such as diabetes and cardiology, at least putting new R&D resources. Instead, they're going to be focusing their R&D on oncology, rare diseases, and MS. The company clearly seems to like this, plus the plan to boost margins. And then Netflix, though, down about 3%. This on the cut to the equivalent of a sell at Needham. The analysts there saying they could lose millions of subscribers in the coming years as competition and pricing heats up. So there were some decent movers beneath the surface, but overall, very small moves for stocks and bonds in Tuesday's Wall Street session, neutral risk appetite, as investors wait for some sort of a definitive trade headlines. From New York, Abigail Doolittle, Bloomberg News.
All right, and that seems to be the case for the Asia-Pacific region as well. I'm joined live by Rosalind Chin from the Bloomberg studios in Hong Kong. Seemingly small moves today across the board, Rosalind, waiting for, I guess, both the Fed decision later today as well as the deadline of the 15th of December, which is now imminent.
Yes, Alex, I think you're right there. We did see a little bit more risk-off sentiment coming into the markets after those comments by Peter Navarro. You know, he's known to be a hawk, so not a big surprise when he says, for example, that there is no indication that the White House is going to lift those tariffs, which were scheduled to be imposed on Sunday, December 15th. That's the deadline, of course, that everyone is waiting for. However, of course, then again, that is also no surprise, even though China has been saying, or at least Bloomberg has been reporting, that sources are telling us Chinese officials are expecting those tariffs increases to be delayed. So right now, as you say, not a lot of movement from investors here. People really waiting to and watching as we come up to the end of the year as well. People starting to focus on what might be happening in the first quarter of 2020. So right now, we've got the MSCI Asia Pacific Index losing at just over 0.1%. The Nikkei down by just over 0.25%. Topics deeper losses there, down by about 0.5% right now. Hang Seng opened lower. That is now down by but only a little bit, down by 0.05%. In China, those stocks opened higher, actually, with the Shanghai Composite up. Currently, though, making gains of less than 0.1%. Japan, we saw, yes, those stocks, they're extending those losses again. China, in Australia, the S&P ASX 200 is actually making gains right now, up by just under 0.1%. We are looking at Jetstar, because that's apparently is going to be but the pilots there are apparently going to be calling a strike over the weekend. That's according to the Sydney Morning Herald. And so Jetstar has cancelled 90 weekend flights in preparation for that pilot strike. That's a note there, of course, in case anyone is travelling in Australia this coming weekend. We've also, of course, had some movement on the pound there after that YouGov poll showed that the lead of Boris Johnson's Conservative Party potentially could be cut. Of course, it's a poll, but potential lead could be weakening ahead of those elections on Thursday. And of course, as you mentioned, that upcoming Fed rate decision as well. So overall, really a watching and waiting situation here on the Asian markets. Back to you.
Thanks so much for that, Rosalind. Let's talk a little bit more about that Fed meeting. The two-day meeting, of course, of the U.S. Federal Reserve began yesterday after a strong jobs report for November, though bets that the Fed will cut interest rates tonight have cooled significantly. However, what is keenly watched for is Jerome Powell's commentary on the trajectory of rates going forward. Kathleen Hayes gets us the expectations for tonight.
That strong jobs report, whether or not it lasts, we don't know. Biggest payrolls gained since January, rising wages. This puts the focus on the dots. But before we go to the chart, let me point something out. That when the Fed, every 3 months, they revise their forecasts for GDP, unemployment, inflation, and their forecast of where rates are going. Well, in September, most on the FOMC thought they were going to be done cutting rates. They didn't forecast more rate cuts after the September meeting. So what does this mean for the dots revision, the revision of their forecasts now? Come into the dots go with me, and what you're going to see is this, what I just said. You can see 7 out of 17 we're looking for the funds rate to go where it went at the last meeting in October, down to 1.62 roughly is the median. So presumably when they change their dots, some of these dots are going to have to move down because we know the rate is lower. Where does that leave 2020? We don't know. A lot of people are betting no change, that in fact they're going to end up not moving and being at 1.62 by the end of the year. But any change in that dot matrix to hawkish or dovish could make a difference. Now, also very important to realize, no dissents expected. Jay Powell really leading the consensus here. No big changes in their policy statement, which gives their view of the economy and where rates are. What's so important, when you see Jay Powell at the last press conference, what does he say in particular about the trade war? It won't be resolved tomorrow. We're pretty sure about that. But remember, the 3 rate cuts this year were driven by this need for preemptive moves, a trade war that's raging, manufacturing that is weakening. That was then, this is now. What will Jay Powell say about it would take in the future to cut again, do a reassessment of the outlook? These are the kind of things that investors, markets are going to be waiting to hear.
Well, that's not all. So we'll come to know about that later tonight. But on to news from the trade front. China now expects that the looming tariff deadline of the 15th of December will be delayed as the two sides continue to assert that they are close to signing an interim trade deal. The acting chief of White House staff, Mick Mulvaney, has said that the signing of any deal will depend on how talks progress in the near term. Tom McKenzie and Josh Wingrove of Bloomberg News get you the updates from both sides.
Well, I think the mood music is a little bit more positive. As you say, we do now hear that the Chinese officials expect those December the 15th tariffs to be delayed at the very least. And of course, we heard from Sonny Perdue, the Agriculture Secretary in the US, just a day or so ago, saying he doesn't think those December the 15th tariffs will be imposed. The other part of this that is important for China is the progress that's been made in terms of the tariffs that are already and have already been imposed on Chinese goods. You remember 25% on about $250 billion worth of Chinese goods, 15% on about $110 billion worth of goods. Now, a key demand from China for this initial deal, phase 1 deal, was a rollback of those tariffs. What we're hearing is that they're now looking at reducing the level of tariffs, maybe by up to 50%, again, depending on how much progress is being made. So that would address one side of China's key demands. The other areas that we know have been progress on are intellectual property and commitments around not manipulating their currencies from both sides. But we also hear that one contentious issue still is the amount of agricultural purchases that the US is demanding from China, and specifically a time frame, because of course the US are concerned that China might commit to something but not follow through, so they're trying to pressure China to sign up to a time frame. China, it appears, is reluctant because of course they're already sourcing some of these agricultural products from other countries. They've got pressure from other trading partners, so that's an area that still needs to be worked out. And of course this is all just part of the phase one deal if we do get that, and then we move on to the trickier subjects of things like industrial policy and state subsidies.
So, Josh, is a tariff hike come this Sunday in play or not? What are we hearing from the White House?
You know, they've been dropping hints for a couple weeks saying, you know, there could be surprises, things are looking good. Trump, you know, always says that this remains on the table, and, you know, that is his standard MO. I'm reminded of June, actually. You recall he threatened tariffs on Mexico, across the board, 5% tariffs, unless Mexico did something about immigration. And it was a very similar situation where that deadline was going to fall on a weekend, and everyone was pretty sure he'd have to do something maybe on the Friday, or at least get the wheels rolling, and it wasn't clear that that was happening. And then boom, they announced a deal. You know, we don't know where this is going to land. I have been proven wrong in predictions before. Tom's use of the word mood music is interesting because Larry Kudlow himself uses that phrase and said it's been good lately. But Kudlow said today that, listen, the tariff hike remains on the table. It's possible. But, you know, we basically hear a lot more hints that, you know, there could be a path here than sort of overt threats that come, you know, one thing or another. Those tariffs are coming on the 15th. So it feels like it's heading in one direction.
Now, besides the Fed decision and the tariff deadline, U.S. President Donald Trump has got something else to worry about as well. U.S. House Democrats have formally laid out their allegations against President Donald Trump, making the case for his potential impeachment and removal from office. Trump, however, called the impeachment articles very weak. Joe Sobzik of Bloomberg News tells us what those two articles contain.
Well, it's a pretty tightly focused resolution. It's only 9 pages long, and it deals almost exclusively with Trump's interactions with the Ukrainian government and allegations that he sought a favor from them to start an investigation of former Vice President Joe Biden. They also accuse him of obstructing Congress in its lawful and constitutional oversight capacity. So it's very narrowly drawn. It's designed to present a fairly clear narrative of what they view President did wrong, and it will be voted on in the House probably by next week. Then it'll move over to the Senate for a trial beginning sometime in early to mid-January. It's not really expected that the Senate would vote to convict. Republicans hold a majority there. There has been fairly unwavering support for the president, so it looks most likely that this will end in his acquittal, and he'll remain in office and face voters in November 2020.
And in the midst of all of this, what a time to be hosting Russia's top diplomat, Sergei Lavrov. What came out of that meeting?
Right. Well, it was a closed meeting with the president and Secretary of State Michael Pompeo. Beforehand, Pompeo and Lavrov did have a press conference in which they had a somewhat testy exchange over Russian election interference in the U.S. Lavrov denying it, saying that it was all baseless and merely speculation. They went into the closed meeting, and interestingly, the White House readout from that meeting afterwards said that, among other topics that Trump had raised, was this election interference by Russia, along with trade and China and several other issues. However, the Russians came out, and there was a statement that Lavrov says that they did not discuss the U.S. elections in that meeting. We haven't had a response yet from the White House to clarify what the differences are, but it's another example of there being sort of two stories. This same thing happened in 2017 when Trump and Lavrov met shortly after the firing of James Comey, and the Russians had put out pictures and statements about the meeting, even though it was closed to U.S. press.
All right, let's see what else is making headlines across the globe. Sue Keenan of Bloomberg News brings you the First Word headlines.
Going to start with the latest on that North American trade deal. The rewritten successor to NAFTA is being welcomed by House Democrats and will be voted on next week. Speaker Nancy Pelosi lauded the changes her party has been able to negotiate, saying the revised deal is better for American workers. The USMCA Accord, as it is called, is seen as a political win for the president as he heads into an election year, but final approval from the Senate is not expected soon.
So let me start by telling you what won't happen between now and the end of next week. We will not be doing USMCA in the Senate between now and the end of next week. That'll have to come up, in all likelihood, right after the trial is finished in the Senate.
Other dealing in Congress, President Trump says the 2 articles of impeachment delivered against him are, quote, very weak. House Democrats are calling for his removal from office for abuse of power and for preventing Congress from exercising its duty as a check on the executive branch. The resolution also accuses Trump of ignoring and injuring national security for personal benefit. The impeachment vote is expected to pass in the House, but to stand little chance in the Senate. And a U.S. court has permanently banned President Trump from using billions of dollars in military construction funds to pay for the border wall with Mexico. The order follows an earlier ruling that his declaration of a national emergency to justify using the money was illegal. However, the judge said he is not blocking the president from appropriating funds earmarked for counter-drug operations. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Sue Keenan. This is Bloomberg.
All right, let's turn to the Indian markets now. Agam Vakil is here to set you up for the day's trade and also to tell you what's happening in the futures and options space. Good morning, Agam. How are we looking? Also, if you've had a look at the ban, we've got a few viewers who are looking at Yes Bank and wondering whether it's still in the bank. I told them that it isn't.
Well, actually, it may very well be, but let's start by taking a look at the markets. And well, for now, we're not looking at too much in terms of the change or the move, for that matter. Let's pull up the SGX Nifty futures, and there you have it. Well, we're looking at subdued cues. And moving on, we also have, well, not too much going in for the indices yesterday, considering we did see some amount of weakness seeping in. But, you know, as far as your banking indices are concerned, well, we have seen a little more of weakness coming in there as well. As far as your ADRs go, we have mixed cues coming in. Again, not too much, not very large movements coming for any of these counters, but we have some strength in Dr. Reddy's or Wipro for that matter. But let's also talk about your fund flows, and well, the 367 odd crores on a net basis sold. On the other hand, 338 crores from DIIs bought on a net basis. So a fairly evenly poised, but selling has returned as far as FIs are concerned. And you know, as coming down to your contributors, we do have ITC, TCS, and Reliance Industries, some of the heavier weighted companies, well, weighing down on the indices clearly. As far as futures and options markets go, we do have very little activity for the Nifty futures, and the Nifty banking futures also looking at, for a change, an addition after 2 straight days of unwinding coming through in its open interest of nearly 6%. But, you know, your open interest distribution for now, we have seen the 11,500 put take over as the one with the maximum open interest from the 12,000 put. And of course, on the higher end, we do see 12,000, 12,100, 12,200 with a little more resistance building in. And that will be evident in the change in open interest, because there you have it. We've seen it writing around the 12,000 call. And of course, more additions in the 11,500 puts as well. But moving on, we also have the WIX, which surprisingly came off. Now, a lot of people are puzzled as to why the WIX is coming off, despite the fact that the markets have been quite volatile. And the reason here is that now there's been a little bit of a spread between weekly options, and that's why we don't necessarily always get the WIX to move up significantly, even as the indices will advance. But in terms of the put call ratio, that has also come off, and this is on expected lines to around 1.2. Well, in stocks and F&O ban, so for now, Yes Bank has not come off. My suspicion was that it would have come off, but I reckon in the last half an hour of trade, we did see, well, once again, that accumulation there, which is why it stays in the F&O ban, or rather, it moves out of the F&O ban. And let's move on and talk about the other stocks too. We have Apollo Hospitals, Apollo Tires, and G1 Financial Services, which have seen, well, accumulation in open interest. And in terms of stocks, which are seeing unwinding, Tata Elxsi, Equitas Holding, and PVR will also be in focus. So mixed year of trade. And, well, Alex, we've seen a lot of consolidation of late, and that's likely what we are expecting today.
All right. Well, thanks so much for that, Agam. All right, well, let's have a look at what's making let's talk about the stocks that you have to watch out for in trade today. Particularly, I would think Yes Bank. There are several developments in that. Like Agam said, it's not in the F&O ban anymore. Somit Sarkar is joining me now to tell you all about the stocks in news. Somit, over to you.
Good morning, Alice. I'll start off with Reliance Industries, where they have signed a joint agreement with the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company to explore development of ethylene dichloride. Now, that is ADNOC Abu Dhabi National Oil Company would supply ethylene to the potential joint venture and provide access to world-class infrastructure, while Reliance Industries will deliver operational expertise and entry to the large and growing Indian vinyls market, which is the key participant when it comes to ethylene dichloride. Secondly, Yes Bank, because they are willing to consider the offer of $500 million of Cytex Holdings, and they also said that the $1.2 billion binding offer from Arvind Brej is under discussion. The bank will take a final decision on Cytex offer in the next meeting. That is what the Yes Bank said. Bharti Airtel, because they will be seeking shareholders approval for raising capital via QIP and debt instruments on Jan 3rd. Now on December 4th, if you remember, the company had planned to raise close to $3 billion, that is 21,500 crore rupees, via debt and equity shares or convertible instruments. Now equity issuance would lead to a dilution of nearly 6% for Bharti Airtel. IDBI Bank, because the board has given an in-principle approval to sell the bank's stake in its arm, that is IDBI Capital Market Securities and IDBI Intech, to the extent of 49% to an investor. In this way, the bank will also retain the controlling stake in both these arms. Bharti Infratel, because they have declared a dividend of 2.75 rupees per share, and the record date for this dividend has been set at December 20. Piramal Enterprises, because CCI has approved the subscription of convertible debentures of the company by CDPQ. Now, upon conversion, the equity shareholding of CDPQ in Piramal Enterprises will increase to 9% from current 3.7%. Future Supply Chain Solutions, because CCI has also approved acquisition of Nippon Express for about 22% stake in the company. Lastly, a couple of stocks that would remain in focus on the back of bull deals. Firstly, Safari Industries, where Malabar India Fund has acquired nearly 1.5 lakh shares, that is 0.7% stake, while the promoter has sold 1.9 lakh shares, that is close to 0.8% stake. And secondly, V-Guard Industries, where promoter has sold nearly 51.2 lakh shares, that is 1.2% stake in the company.
All right, thanks so much for that, Somit. Well, protests continue to rage across northeastern region of India after the Citizenship Amendment Bill was passed in the Lok Sabha. Protests raged across Assam, Tripura and northern parts of West Bengal. The bill will be tabled for discussion in the Rajya Sabha today. Take a look. In Australia, bushfires continue along the east coast and the smoke-filled air has gripped the city of Sydney. It is so bad that it has begun to set off fire alarms. Sibylla Gross of Bloomberg News explains.
It's been almost impossible to see the Harbour Bridge behind me as the bushfire smoke continues to cloud Sydney. The smoke actually set off fire alarms all across Sydney in multiple office buildings, including the Bloomberg office.
A fire has been detected on this floor.
People were evacuated across the city, sporting events were cancelled, ferries were cancelled as well, and that's a really important means of public transport for Sydney-siders and doesn't happen often at all. The office buildings were filled with smoke. A lot of people were wearing face masks like the one I'm wearing inside because the smoke was just impossible to escape. It's looking like these worsening air conditions will be a recurrent theme throughout summer, and summer's really only just begun.
All right, there's clearly lots to talk about over the course of the day, and you'll find all the live market action right here on BloombergQuint Live. But there are also several stories that are currently on the website BloombergQuint.com that you should check out. First up, creditors of Jet Airways India have agreed to extend the deadline for submission of a resolution plan for the grounded Indian Airlines 14,600 crore rupees of debt, as the sole bidder for the company is hesitating to make a binding offer. The deadline for the submission of the resolution plan for the carrier may be extended beyond the 16th of December, as Synergy Group will not make a binding offer for Jet Airways till it gets clarity from the government about the validity of the airline's now defunct flying slots. And Flipkart has invested close to 600 crore rupees in its digital payments arm, PhonePe, providing much-needed firepower against rivals Google Pay, Paytm and Amazon Pay. The funding also comes amid reports that Flipkart owner Walmart is looking to hive off PhonePe into a separate entity, a move that could help the payments firm raise funds independently. That's all you need to know going into trade today, but do stay tuned. Clearly, lots of action in the session today. You'll find all of that on BloombergQuint.
So people, when they invest and the calls go right, they're